5:47 a.m., May 14, 2026. San Diego, California. 11 federal agents moved in single file along the outer dock of Shelter Island Marina, boots silent on the weathered planking. The water was black, the sky just beginning to separate gray from dark. Slip 44C, a 60-foot Sunseeker Manhattan, white hull, nameplate reading Meridian Blue in brushed chrome. Estimated asset value, $1, 4 million. Estimated transactions flowing through its registered operator, $3, 8 million over the previous 18 months. The agents stopped. The cabin lights were on. Someone was already awake. What followed in the next 4 minutes would close a 6-month operation that had begun not in California, not in a field office, but in a government building in Washington, D.C., where an analyst staring at a spreadsheet of wire transfers noticed something that shouldn't have been possible. This isn't a story about a single arrest on a dock in San Diego. It's a story about how a man who had been officially dead to the financial system for 14 months managed to move nearly $4 million across 3 continents, build a functioning luxury business in Southern California, and keep brokering sanctioned Iranian petroleum, all while paying California taxes and hosting corporate clients on champagne cruises. The name he was using at that marina, David Calloway. The name on a 2019 Treasury Department sanctions list, Farshad Tehrani. The gap between those two identities is where this entire case lived. In October 2025, the Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, ran a routine sweep of maritime financial transactions flagged by correspondent banking systems in Europe, the kind of work that rarely produces results. Wire transfers, shell entities, holding companies registered in jurisdictions where disclosure laws are structured to minimize disclosure. One cluster of transactions didn't fit. A Maltese maritime holding company, registered as Aqualink Holdings Limited, had executed a series of wire transfers totaling $3, 8 million over 4 months. The transfers moved through 2 intermediary accounts in Cyprus before landing in accounts used to purchase fuel brokerage licenses in 3 Gulf states, the UAE, Oman, and Bahrain. On their own, fuel brokerage license purchases are unremarkable. The maritime industry runs on brokerage. What was remarkable? All 3 purchasing entities shared a single beneficial owner, a layer of ownership the Maltese filing only partially obscured. When OFAC analysts cross-referenced that beneficial ownership data against their sanctions database, one name came back: Farshad Tehrani, Iranian national. Sanctioned in May 2019 for facilitating the export of Iranian crude oil in violation of U.S. Treasury sanctions. Last known address: a residential compound in Dubai, UAE. Passport status: no registered border crossing in 14 months. Tehrani's file wasn't large. He wasn't a major figure, not a cartel boss, not a weapons trafficker. He was an operator, a fixer, the kind of person who built relationships between Iranian petroleum interests and the international brokers who could move that oil without attracting attention. Sanctioned not for running the scheme, but for enabling it, for being the man in the middle. And now, according to the wire transfer data, he appeared to be doing it again. The OFAC analyst who made the connection was a 12-year veteran named Sarah Whitfield. She flagged the cluster, escalated, and within 72 hours the file had moved to the OFAC Enforcement Division. The first question? Where was Tehrani? At that point, genuinely unknown. The investigation formally launched in November 2025 as a joint operation between 3 agencies: OFAC Enforcement, Homeland Security Investigations, and the U.S. Marshals Service Fugitive Task Force, Southern District of California. The Marshals component was unusual. Fugitive task forces typically chase people who have been charged and fled. Tehrani hadn't been charged yet, but the Marshals' involvement reflected a calculation that had become standard in complex financial fugitive cases. If they were going to locate and arrest this individual, they needed a team built for tracking people across borders, not just tracking money. HSI brought financial intelligence and maritime expertise. OFAC brought the sanctions architecture. The Marshals brought the network of informants, aviation assets, and cross-border coordination with foreign law enforcement counterparts that had, over the previous decade, made them the most effective fugitive location agency in the federal system. The 3 agencies established a joint working group. Task Force designation, Operation Tidemark. The first 6 weeks produced almost nothing. Tehrani's last known digital footprint placed him in Dubai in August 2024. After that, nothing. His Iranian passport had not registered an entry into any country that shared border data with U.S. intelligence partners. His known associates had gone quiet. The Maltese company was managed by a registered agent in Valletta who handled hundreds of similar entities and claimed no direct knowledge of the beneficial owner. 3 months of surveillance, financial tracing, and international coordination. 0 confirmed sightings. Then, in late January 2026, an HSI analyst named Kevin Morse ran a cross-check no one had thought to run yet. He took the beneficial ownership structure of Aqualink Holdings and mapped it against U.S. visa entry data, not under Tehrani's Iranian passport, but under any passport that had entered the United States in the previous 18 months, matching his approximate biometric profile. The hit came back on a Canadian passport. Name, David R. Calloway. Date of birth, matching Tehrani's known birth year within 18 months. Entry point, Los Angeles International Airport. Date of entry, March 2025. The real David Calloway had died in Toronto in 2021. A check of Canadian mortality records, requiring a formal request through the State Department, confirmed it. Farshad Tehrani had entered the United States on a fraudulent identity document. He had been living in Southern California for over a year. I spent considerable time in the case documentation on this, and one detail kept nagging: the passport. Obtaining a high-quality fraudulent Canadian passport, one that clears biometric screening at a major U.S. international airport, is not a casual transaction. This required connections, infrastructure. Whoever supplied that document had done it before. That thread would matter later. But in January 2026, the immediate priority was finding where David Calloway had gone after clearing customs at LAX. The answers surfaced through California DMV records, business registry filings, and a single credit card transaction. The card was issued under the Calloway identity. The transaction: deposit payment to a boat broker in Coronado, California, dated April 2025. Tehrani had bought a yacht. More precisely, he had established a limited liability company, Blue Pacific Charter Solutions, LLC, registered in California with a listed business address in Coronado. The company offered luxury yacht charters to corporate clients, rates starting at $8,500 per day. The Meridian Blue, the Sunseeker 60, was the company's primary asset. On paper, Blue Pacific Charter Solutions was an entirely legitimate California business. It had filed tax returns. It had a website. It had client reviews on maritime hospitality platforms. It employed a licensed captain and 2 deckhands. Farshad Tehrani, operating as David Calloway, had built a functional cover business, and built it well enough that it had been operating without attracting any law enforcement attention for 11 months before OFAC found the Maltese wire transfers. What struck investigators about this case, and what rarely surfaces in the public record, is how effectively this approach exploits the gap between financial intelligence systems and immigration enforcement systems. Those two systems don't talk to each other automatically. They require human intervention to connect. Tehrani understood that gap and built his operation in the space it created. The surveillance phase of Operation Tidemark began in February 2026. By that point, the task force had confirmed Tehrani's identity, established his location, and documented Blue Pacific Charter Solutions. What they didn't have: evidence connecting his California business operations to the sanctioned petroleum transactions flowing through the Maltese holding company. Without that connection, they had a fraud case: identity theft, passport fraud, entry under false pretenses. With it, they had a sanctions evasion case, a federal charge with significantly more weight, and one that would support the kind of asset seizure that could disrupt the broader network. The task force chose to surveil rather than arrest, a calculated risk. Tehrani appeared to have no reason to suspect federal surveillance. His California business was generating legitimate revenue. His client list included technology companies, real estate investment groups, and a financial advisory firm in La Jolla. HSI established a fixed surveillance position on a pier adjacent to the marina. Marshals rotated mobile surveillance assets through Coronado and La Jolla. A court-authorized electronic surveillance order, obtained from the Southern District of California in late February, allowed monitoring of communications associated with the Calloway identity. For 6 weeks, surveillance produced useful but not decisive intelligence. Tehrani maintained a low profile. He was at the marina most mornings. He handled logistics for charter departures. He communicated with clients by email and phone, all under the Calloway identity. His communications were professional, limited, and gave nothing away. The obstacle the task force hit in March 2026 was technical. The electronic surveillance on the Calloway identity communications wasn't capturing what they needed. Tehrani was clearly compartmentalizing. Whatever communications he was maintaining with the Omani shell company, the layer through which the sanctioned petroleum transactions were allegedly flowing, were not going through the Callaway phone or the Callaway email. There was a second device. The task force knew it existed. They couldn't locate it. The solution came from an unexpected direction, the Marina's own infrastructure. As part of a 2023 facility upgrade, Coronado Marina had installed a broadband satellite uplink system for vessel berths. Liveaboard residents and extended stay charter operators paid a monthly fee. The system logged connection data. A subpoena to the Marina's management company produced usage logs for Slip 44C going back 8 months. The Meridian Blue had been making regular connections to a satellite communication service, not a consumer service, but an industrial maritime SATCOM provider. The uplink frequency and data volumes were inconsistent with recreational use. They matched the patterns of vessels conducting regular encrypted data transfers. That satellite terminal, aboard the Meridian Blue, was the second device. If you've ever tried to investigate a communication channel you can see the existence of but can't directly access, imagine doing that while the person you're watching is close enough that one wrong move exposes your entire operation. That's where the task force was in late March 2026. The breakthrough came in April. An HSI analyst with maritime signals experience ran the SATCOM usage logs against a global database of commercial maritime satellite traffic. The Meridian Blue's uplink signature matched communication sessions with a single other terminal, a vessel registered under Omani flag, last documented position in the Gulf of Oman, operating under the name Al Sakr Maritime Services. Al Sakr Maritime Services. The name wasn't in OFAC's sanctions database. But when HSI ran the beneficial ownership structure of the Omani company, they found a familiar pattern. Nominee directors, a registered agent in Muscat, and at the base of the structure. The same Maltese holding company, Aqualink Holdings, Ltd., that had originally triggered Sarah Whitfield's flag in Washington. Tehrani wasn't just continuing to broker sanctioned petroleum. He was doing it through a vessel actively operating in the Gulf, in an area where U.S., Navy, and Coast Guard assets were conducting maritime interdiction operations related to Iranian crude oil smuggling. The task force escalated immediately. The case moved from a joint OFAC, HSI, Marshals operation to one that involved Navy intelligence and the Fifth Fleet. Within 72 hours of that escalation, U.S. Navy assets in the Gulf had identified the Al Sakr vessel by position and updated its status in the Maritime Interdiction database. The ship was flagged, not boarded, not arrested, but flagged and tracked. This was the first time, in the task force's collective experience, that a sanctions evasion case originating from a financial wire transfer flag had directly intersected with active naval interdiction operations in the Strait of Hormuz. The financial crime on a California marina dock had a physical counterpart in international waters 6,000 miles away. The two threads were now joined. Here's the take that's going to generate some disagreement. Tehrani operated for over a year in Southern California, paying taxes, hosting clients, building a business. And that reflects a structural failure in how U.S. financial intelligence and immigration enforcement share data. The tools to catch him existed in October 2025 only because an analyst ran a cross-agency check that wasn't part of any standard protocol. If Sarah Whitfield had flagged a different cluster of wires that month, or if Kevin Morse hadn't thought to run biometric entry data against the beneficial ownership structure, Tehrani might still be operating today. That's not a failure of individual judgment. It's a system that relies on individual initiative to catch gaps the system itself creates. The decision to move toward arrest came in late April 2026. The evidence package at that point included wire transfer records linking Aqualink Holdings to sanctioned petroleum brokerage, satellite communication logs linking the Meridian Blue to the Al Sakr vessel, beneficial ownership documentation connecting the Omani company to the Maltese holding company to Tehrani, the fraudulent Canadian passport, and 14 months of physical and electronic surveillance. The case was presented to the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of California. Charges filed under seal. Sanctions, evasion under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, use of a fraudulent passport, entry into the United States under false pretenses, wire fraud, and conspiracy to defraud the United States. The sealed indictment was signed May 8, 2026. The task force then had a 6-day window to plan the arrest. The primary concern. The Meridian Blue was a mobile asset. If Tehrani took the vessel into international waters, where arrest procedures are governed by maritime law rather than standard federal warrant execution, the operation became significantly more complicated. Surveillance showed Tehrani had a charter departure scheduled for May 14th, a corporate client group. 7 individuals from a technology company based in San Jose had booked a full-day charter to Catalina Island. Departure time, 7 a.m. The task force decided to move before that departure. If Tehrani left the dock with 7 civilians aboard, attempting the arrest on the water created unacceptable risk. The window, before 7 a.m. on May 14th. The plan called for simultaneous operations at 2 locations. Primary, the marina, slip 44C. Secondary, a rented house in La Jolla where Tehrani lived under the Callaway identity. The La Jolla address had been identified in March through a lease agreement cross-referenced with the DMV registration on a vehicle tied to Blue Pacific Charter Solutions. 11 agents on the dock, 8 agents at the La Jolla residence, 3 additional agents at the marina entrance to control vehicle access. Trigger time, 5:47 a.m. What the task force didn't know until 5:30 a.m. that morning, 17 minutes before the operation was set to begin, was that the marina's dock gate security camera system had been upgraded 2 days earlier. The upgrade had temporarily disabled the electronic access logs. Agents who needed to know whether Tehrani was aboard the vessel or at the La Jolla house couldn't rely on the gate access records they'd been counting on. An HSI agent with the surveillance team resolved it directly. She walked the outer dock at 5:15 a.m. in civilian clothes, confirmed the Meridian Blue's cabin lights were on, and heard movement below deck. Tehrani was aboard. The surveillance team relayed confirmation at 5:42 a.m. 5 minutes later, the operation began, 5:47 a.m. 11 agents moved along the outer dock of Shelter Island Marina. No vehicle lights, no radio communications above a whisper. The agent at the front of the stack, Marshals Task Force, reached the gangway of the Meridian Blue at 5:51 a.m. 2 agents secured the stern line. 2 more positioned at the bow. The remaining 7 staged on the dock behind the gangway. At 5:52 a.m., the lead agent stepped aboard, moved to the cabin hatch, and knocked 3 times, followed by a verbal announcement. Federal agents. Arrest warrant. Come to the door. 17 seconds of silence. The hatch opened. Farshad Tehrani, operating as David Callaway, businessman, charter operator, California taxpayer, stood in the hatchway in deck shoes and a fleece pullover. He looked at the agents. He looked past them at the dock. He said nothing. He was placed in handcuffs without resistance. Simultaneously, 8 miles north in La Jolla, 8 agents executed the search warrant at the rented house on Camino de la Costa. No resistance. Tehrani had been sleeping aboard the vessel, as surveillance had suggested. The house was unoccupied. The search of the La Jolla residence produced a fireproof document safe containing 2 passports, the fraudulent Callaway document and a second document in a third identity, this one bearing a Kitts and Nevis citizenship seal, $47,000 in U.S. currency, a separate encrypted laptop, and a manila folder of handwritten notes in Farsi. The notes would require translation. Their contents, when translated, would expand the case beyond what anyone on the task force had anticipated. Aboard the Meridian Blue, agents secured the satellite terminal, a commercial maritime SATCOM unit consistent with offshore business communications, not recreational use. They seized 2 encrypted laptops, a portable hard drive, and printed wire transfer records. The records showed transactions the task force hadn't previously identified, an additional $1. 1 million in transfers predating the Maltese cluster, flowing through a separate Bahraini account. The total financial picture was now significantly larger than the original $3. 8 million flag. Does a case like this show a system working the way it should, or a system that got lucky? The answer matters for understanding how many cases like this never get caught. Tehrani was transported to the Metropolitan Correctional Center in San Diego, arraigned the following day. At his initial appearance, he declined to enter a plea. His attorney, retained counsel, not public defender, requested bail. The government opposed. The magistrate judge agreed. Flight risk, foreign connections, fraudulent identity documents, remanded without bail. The La Jolla notes in Farsi took 11 days to fully translate and analyze. They contained references to at least 2 other individuals operating in a similar capacity, under false identities in Western countries, maintaining communication with Iranian petroleum intermediaries through encrypted maritime satellite channels. One reference appeared to point to a person in Hamburg, Germany, another to someone in Athens, Greece. The task force shared that intelligence with HSI international attachés in both countries within 24 hours. Whether it produced additional investigations is not part of the public record. The Al-Saka vessel in the Gulf of Oman was boarded by U.S. Navy personnel under Maritime Interdiction Authority on May 19, 2026, 5 days after Tehrani's arrest. The boarding was conducted under the Proliferation Security Initiative, which allows interdiction of vessels suspected of carrying sanctioned goods. The vessel's manifest listed general cargo. Its actual cargo, as determined by Navy personnel and a joint HSI Navy inspection team, 840,000 barrels of Iranian crude oil in transit. Estimated market value of the cargo, $67 million. That figure, $67 million in sanctioned Iranian petroleum, traced back to brokerage communications made from a marina slip in Coronado, California, is the point at which this case moved from a sanctions evasion investigation to something with direct implications for U.S. naval policy in the Gulf. One detail that stuck with me in the case documentation: the 7 corporate clients who had booked the May 14th charter to Catalina Island. They showed up at the marina at 7:15 a.m., 15 minutes late per the dockmaster's log, and found their vessel surrounded by federal agents and crime scene tape. They were interviewed. None had any knowledge of who David Calloway actually was. Their company had found Blue Pacific Charter Solutions through a corporate events planning firm that had booked similar charters with no indication of irregularity. The events firm was subsequently contacted by HSI and provided full cooperation. The 7 clients went home. The charter was refunded. The Meridian Blue was seized as a forfeiture asset. The case established something with no direct precedent in OFAC enforcement history: a direct evidentiary chain from a financial wire transfer flag in Washington to a fraudulent identity document, to a physical asset on a California marina dock, to an active petroleum cargo in the Gulf of Oman, to a Navy interdiction operation. 5 agencies, 6 months, 3 continents. As of the public record available, Tehrani faces charges carrying a potential sentence of up to 45 years. The sanctions evasion counts alone, under IEPA, carry up to 20 years per count. He has maintained a not guilty posture. No trial date has been set. Plea negotiations, according to sources familiar with the case, have taken place without resolution. The fraudulent passport supplier, whoever provided the document that got Tehrani through LAX biometric screening in March 2025, has not been identified. The investigation into that supply chain is ongoing, per court filings. HSI considers it an open priority, a passport good enough to pass biometric screening at a major U.S. airport doesn't come from a single forger. It comes from a network. That network has not been found. Comment yes or no. Do you think the passport supply chain gets traced back, or does that thread go cold? We read every comment. The wire transfers that triggered this case. The original $3. 8 million cluster Sarah Whitfield flagged in October 2025 represented a fraction of the financial activity federal investigators ultimately connected to Tehrani's operations. The Bahraini account record seized at the La Jolla residence suggested a total transaction volume closer to $12 million over 26 months. Of that $12 million, approximately $3. $8 million has been frozen in the Maltese and Cypriot accounts through OFAC designation orders. The remaining approximately $8, $2 million has not been located. It has moved. Where it moved to is currently unknown to investigators. That is not a small number. $8 million connected to Iranian petroleum sanctions evasion, unaccounted for in the financial system. The Omani shell company, Al-Saka Maritime Services, has been designated by OFAC as a sanctioned entity. Its registered agent in Muscat has been contacted by Omani authorities. The investigation into the Omani entity's broader network is being conducted jointly with Omani Financial Intelligence Services. Whether that cooperation produces actionable intelligence has not been made public. The Maltese registered agent, the company that managed Aqualink Holdings, has provided full cooperation with U.S. and European Union financial intelligence requests. Malta's Financial Intelligence Unit has opened its own review of the registered agent's broader client portfolio. The scope of that review is not public. Here's something the public record doesn't make clear. Tehrani's operation wasn't unique in its structure. The use of fraudulent Western identities, legitimate cover businesses, and maritime SATCOM channels to maintain sanctioned petroleum brokerage is a documented pattern, not an improvised scheme. OFAC has identified similar structures in at least 3 other investigations over the previous 4 years. Different individuals, different jurisdictions, different petroleum routes. But the architecture is nearly identical. The gap in data sharing between financial intelligence and immigration systems that Tehrani exploited is the same gap in each of those cases. If you subscribe now, we'll be covering the federal investigation into that broader architecture, what OFAC's enforcement team has identified as the standard playbook for sanctions evasion in the maritime petroleum sector, and how the agencies are attempting to close the structural gap that makes it possible. Farshad Tehrani remains in federal custody as of the date this documentation was compiled. His assets, the Meridian Blue, the La Jolla Residence Lease, Blue Pacific Charter Solutions LLC, are in various stages of federal forfeiture proceedings. The business is shuttered. The dock slip is empty. The captain and deckhands he employed had no knowledge of his actual identity or the nature of his financial activities. They were interviewed by HSI, cleared of involvement, and separated from employment that no longer existed. The $67 million cargo aboard the Al-Saka vessel was seized by the U.S. Navy and is subject to a separate forfeiture action under maritime law. The legal proceedings involve parties in Oman, Malta, and Cyprus and are expected to take years to resolve. The two individuals referenced in the Farsi notes, the possible Hamburg contact, the possible Athens contact, have not been publicly identified. The investigations into those leads are not part of the public record. The passport network that put Tehrani in Southern California remains unidentified. And somewhere in the international financial system, $8 million connected to this case continues to move. The operation is closed. The network that made it possible still exists.